eating dinner with the Beavers. And the last thing that Mr. Beaver says is, "It's snowing, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, he won't find any tracks." Okay, so here's the preview. Kind of gives you an idea of what might happen. Chapter 8 is called What Happened After Dinner. "And now," said Lucy, "do please tell us what happened to Mr. Tumnus." "Ah, that's bad," said Mr. Beaver, shaking his head. "That's a very, very bad business. There's no doubt he was taken off by the police. I got that from a bird who saw it done." "But where's he been taken to?" asked Lucy. "Well, they were heading northwards when they were last seen, and we all know what that means." "No, we don't," said Susan. Mr. Beaver shook his head in a very gloomy fashion. "I'm afraid it means they were taking him to her house," he said. "But what will they do to him, Mr. Beaver?" gasped Lucy. "Well," said Mr. Beaver, "you can't exactly say for sure, but there's not many taken in there that ever comes out again. Statues, all full of statues, they say it is, in the courtyard and up the stairs and in the hall. People she's turned," he paused and shuddered, "turned into stone." "But Mr. Beaver," said Lucy, "can't we must do something to save him. It's too dreadful, and it's all on my account." "I don't doubt you'd save him if you could, dearie," said Miss Beaver, "but you have no chance of getting into that house against her will and ever coming out alive." "Couldn't we have some stratagem?" said Peter. He's saying, isn't there a plan they could have? Couldn't we dress up as something or pretend to be, peddlers or anything? Watch till she's gone out, or hang it all, there must be some way. This fawn saved my sister at his own risk, Mr. Beaver. We can't leave him to have that done to him." "It's no good, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. "No good your trying, of all people. But now that Aslan's on the move—" "Oh, yes, tell us about Aslan," said several voices at once. And for once again that strange feeling, like the first signs of spring, like good news, had come over them. "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan?" said Mr. Beaver. "Why, you don't know? He's the king. He's the lord of the whole wood. But not here often, you understand. Never in my time or my father's time. But the world has reached out, and he has come back. He is in Narnia at this moment. He'll settle the White Queen all right. It is he, not you, that will save Mr. Tumnus." "Won't she turn him to stone too?" said Edmund. "Lord love you," said son of Adam. "What a simple thing to say," answered Mr. Beaver with a great laugh. "Turn him to stone? If she can't stand on her feet and look at him in the face, it'll be the most she can do, and more than I expect of her. No, he'll put all to rights, as they say in the old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes into sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death, and when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. But you'll understand when you see him." "But shall we see him?" asked Susan. "Why, daughter of Eve, that's what I've brought you here for. I'm to lead you to where you shall meet him," said Mr. Beaver. "Is he a man?" asked Lucy. "Aslan a man?" said Mr. Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is king of beasts? Aslan is a lion. The great lion." "Oh," said Susan, "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, and no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly." "Then he is safe, isn't he?" said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." "I'm longing to see him," said Peter, "even if I do feel frightened when comes to the point." "That's right, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver, bringing his paw down on the table with a crash that made all the cups and saucers rattle. "And you shall. Word has been sent that you are to meet him, tomorrow if you can, at the stone table." "Where's that?" said Lucy. "I'll show you," said Mr. Beaver. "It's down the river, a good step from here. I'll take you to it." "But meanwhile, what about poor Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. The quickest way you can help him is by going to meet Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. Once he's with us, then he can begin doing things. Not that we don't need you, too. There's another of the old rhymes. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. Okay, I don't want to be cut off. No, I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. Okay. So things must be drawing near their end now that now he's come and you've come. We have heard of Aslan coming into these parts long ago. Nobody can say when, but there's never been any of your race here before, meaning humans have never been there, or they've never seen him. That's what I don't understand, Mr. Beaver, said Peter. I mean, isn't the witch herself a human? She'd like us to believe it, said Mr. Beaver, but it's on that she bases her claim to be queen. But she's no daughter of Eve. She comes from your father's Adams. Here, said Mr. Beaver, bowed. Your father's Adam's first wife. Here they call her they call Lilith. She was one of the jinn. That's what. This part is so confusing. I'm sorry. That's what she comes from on one side. On the other side, she comes from giants. No, there isn't a drop of real human blood in the witch. They're talking about the history. If you read the first book in this series, you would know it, but they're saying the witch is not human. That's why she's bad all through, Mr. Beaver, said Mrs. Beaver. True enough, Miss Beaver, he replied. There may be two views about humans, meaning no offense to the present company, but there's not two views about things that look like humans and aren't. I've known good dwarfs, said Mrs. Beaver. So have I. Now you've come to speak of it, said her husband, but precious few, and they were the ones least like men. But in general, take my advice, when you meet anything that's going to be human and isn't, or used to be human once and isn't now, or ought to be human and isn't, you keep your eyes on it and you feel for your hatchet. That's why the witch is always on the lookout for humans in Narnia. She's been watching for you this many a year, and if she knew there were four of you, she'd be more dangerous still. What's that to do with it? Said Peter. Because of another prophecy, said Mr. Beaver. Down at Cair Paravel, that's the castle on the sea coast down at the mouth of the river, which ought to be the capital of the whole country, if it all is as it should be. Down at Cair Paravel there are four thrones. And it's the saying in Narnia time out of mind that when two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve sit on the four thrones, then it will not only end the time of the witch's reign, but her life. And that's why we had to be so cautious when we came along. For if she knew about you four, your lives wouldn't be worth a shake of my whiskers. All the children had been attending so hard that Mr. Beaver was telling them that they hadn't noticed anything else for a long time. Then, during a moment of silence that followed his last remark, Lucy suddenly said, I say, where's Edmund? There was a dreadful pause, and then everyone began asking, Who saw him last? How long has he been missing? Is he outside? And then they all rushed to the door and looked out. The snow was falling thickly and steadily, and the green pool of ice had vanished under a thick white blanket from where the little house stood in the center of the dam, and you could hardly see either bank. Out they went, plunging well over their ankles into the soft new snow, and went around the house in every direction. Edmund! Edmund! They called until they were hoarse, but the silently falling snow seemed to muffle their voices, and there wasn't even an echo in answer. How perfectly dreadful, said Susan at last when they came back inside. Oh, how I wish I'd never come. What on earth do we do, Mr. Beaver? Said Peter. Do, said Mr. Beaver, who was already putting on his snow boots. Do? We must be off at once. There isn't a moment to spare. We'd better divide into 4 search parties, said Peter, and all go in different directions. Whoever finds him must come back here at once. Search parties, son of Adam, said Mr. Beaver. What for? Why, to look for Edmund, of course. There's no point in looking for him, said Mr. Beaver. What do you mean, said Susan. He can't be that far away yet, and we've got to find him. What do you mean there's no use in looking for him? The reason there's no use in looking for him, said Mr. Beaver, is that we know where he's already gone. Everyone stared in amazement. Don't you understand, said Mr. Beaver. He's gone to her, the White Witch. He has betrayed us all. Oh, surely, oh, really, he can't have done that, said Susan. Can't he, said Mr. Beaver, looking very hard at the 3 children, and everything they wanted to say died on their lips, for each suddenly felt quite certain inside that this is exactly what Edmund had done. "But will he know the way?" said Peter. "Has he been to this country before?" asked Mr. Beaver. "Has he ever been here alone?" "Yes," said Lucy, almost in a whisper. "I'm afraid he has." "And did he tell you what he had done or who he had met?" "Well, no, he didn't," said Lucy. "Then mark my words," said Mr. Beaver. "He has already met the White Witch and joined her side and been told where she lives. I didn't like to mention it before, he being your brother and all, but the moment I set eyes on that brother of yours, I said to myself, 'Treacherous.' He had a look of one who has met the witch and eaten her food. You can always tell if you've lived in Narnia long. Something about their eyes." "All the same," said Peter, in a rather choking sort of voice, "we'll still have to go and look for him. He is our brother after all, even if he is a little beast. He's only a kid." "Go to the witch's house?" said Mrs. Beaver. "Why don't you see that the only chance in saving him or yourselves is to keep away from her?" "How do you mean?" said Lucy. "Why, all she wants is to get all four of you. She's thinking all the time of those 4 thrones at Cair Paravel. Once all four of you are inside the house, the job would be done, and there would be 4 new statues in her collection before you had time to speak. But she'll keep him alive as long as he's the only one she's got, because she'll want to use him as a decoy, as bait to catch the rest of you." "Oh, can no one help us?" wailed Lucy. "Only Aslan," said Mr. Beaver. "We must go on and meet him. That's our only chance now." "It seems to me, my dear," said Mrs. Beaver, "that it is very important to know just when he slipped away. How much can he tell her depends on how much he heard. For instance, had we started talking of Aslan before he left? If not, then we may do very well, for she won't know that Aslan has come to Narnia, and that we are meeting him, and will be quite off her guard as far as that is concerned." "I don't remember his being here when we talked about Aslan," began Peter, as Lucy interrupted him. "Oh, yes, he was," she said miserably. "Don't you remember? It was he who asked whether the witch could turn Aslan to stone, too." "So he did, by Jove," said Peter. "Just the sort of thing he would say, too." "Worse and worse," said Mr. Beaver. "The next thing is, was he still here when I told you the place where we are meeting Aslan at the stone table?" And of course no one knew the answer to that question. "Because, if he was," continued Mr. Beaver, "then she'll simply sled down to the direction and go between us and the stone table and catch us on our way down. In fact, we shall be cut off from Aslan." "But that isn't what she'll do first," said Mrs. Beaver. "Not if I know her. The moment that Edmund tells her that we're all here, she shall set us to catch us this very night, and if he has been gone half an hour, then he'll be there in another 20 minutes. "You're right, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband. "We must all get away from here. There's not a moment to lose." Whew. So, Edmund has betrayed the family. All right, questions in the next video.